Singapore Maritime Week 2022 brings together global industry stakeholders to bring mindshare on the complex issue of climate change and to identify the next practical and crucial steps to achieve decarbonisation goals for the maritime industry. The Accelerating Decarbonisation Conference brings together leaders to address the shifts towards decarbonisation, ship owners' decisions on the multi-fuel transition, pathways and opportunities, and the way ahead to building up capabilities and technologies in decarbonisation technologies and solution. The conference also covers reducing emissions from across the supply chain and achieving carbon neutrality in logistics, the role of green finance to meet these green goals, and the interdependencies between decarbonisation, sustainable supply chain, and effects on consumer prices. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, the next session is Setting the Scene, Insights to the Maritime Industry Shift Towards Decarbonisation. The session will be using the online interactive Q&A platform to post your questions and comments. So please, let's show that, and we'll have the Pigeonhole QR code up in a very short while. This is how you can have your questions fielded onto the panel, and you'll be able to vote on your questions as well, on the left and on the right. The center will be for the panelists' names. So please help us to scan that, because I think some of us have not tried Pigeonhole yet. Scan it, put in the passcode SMW2022, and you'll be able to ask questions to the panel, and also you'll be able to vote for your favorite questions so that there's a higher likelihood of them being answered as well. Allow me to introduce your session moderator. He is Nicholas Brown, Chief Executive Officer, Lloyd's Register. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Nicholas, please. Thank you. And Nicholas will be duly inviting the panelists on stage. Thank you, Nicholas.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ambassador Hom, Singapore colleagues, industry representatives. It's wonderful to be back in 3D world. It's really energizing to be back in Asia after 2.5 years absence, certainly for me personally. And as we know today, our world has changed just so much in those 2.5 years. We've heard already from Ambassador Hom about the need for urgency. So without further ado, I'm going to invite my panelists up onto the stage. If I could start with Datuk Yang Chien, CEO of MISC Berhad. Lars Kastrup, co-president at Pacific International Lines. Professor Lynn Liu, CEO of the Global Maritime Decarbonisation Centre. And Cerup-Simonsen, CEO of the Mærsk Møller Centre for Zero Carbon Shipping.
Dear panelists, you may remove your masks as you are socially distanced. Thank you.
So the good news is, for those of us in the room, we won't be saying you're on mute. For those around the world joining online, I will do my best to bring you into the room and bring your questions into the room. So as the MC has already reminded us, please have your questions posted on Pigeonhole, and we'll do our best with the event organisers to have these displayed and answered as we go through. Just as a very brief opener, I want to talk about the importance of accelerating decarbonisation, which is, of course, the purpose of this panel. We're all aware that the impacts of climate change and what this means on our world, and we all know that there's a greater need for action. In February 22, the IPCC report confirmed that climate change will affect all of us more severely than previously thought, and unfortunately it will be the most vulnerable in society that will be hit hardest. The UNFCCC body said that to avoid mounting loss of life, biodiversity, and infrastructure, ambitious, accelerated action is required. At the same time, we must make rapid and deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions. And so far, I think it's fair to say that progress of adaptation is uneven, and there are increasing gaps between action being taken and what is needed to deal with the increasing risks. So we all have a role to play, obviously as individuals, as organizations, as an industry, and indeed as countries. Reassuringly, however, my view is that shipping's collective commitment to deliver on zero emissions by 2050 was really palpable at COP26 in Glasgow last year. Our industry had a higher profile at COP than it had done before, and commitments were signed which placed ambition from the industry ahead of the current IMO regulations. So we aren't waiting for regulation. Among those commitments was the Clydebank Declaration on green corridors. At the time of signing, that involved 22 countries, but we already heard in Monday's opening ceremony event that Singapore will be joining that declaration. And that, of course, gives us an opportunity to get large-scale demonstrator vessels and green corridors actually into action, into service, in a controlled manner. COP26 also saw the Getting to Zero Coalition's call on action and the Declaration for Zero Emission Shipping. And it was a gathering where shipping had a more dominant voice than in the past, with many in the industry expressing their determination to accelerate the pace of decarbonisation within maritime. So here we are, 6 months post COP26. We continue to see lots of partners signing up to action. We continue to see lots of action now being taken. And I'm keen to hear from my esteemed colleagues, leaders in the industry, as to what you feel is going well and where you feel more effort might be required. And particularly, I think it's important that we try and shorten the timeline away from 2050. Let's talk about action in the next 3 to 5 years, or indeed action in the next 12 months. Perhaps I can just ask the panelists if I could start with Datuk and then perhaps go to Lars, and we can hear from the ship owner view, and then move to Lynn and Bo with your opening remarks and thoughts. Please, Datuk first.
Thanks, Nick. Again, it's good to be here. Last year, I was here virtually. The borders were fairly restricted. I couldn't get in, so it's great to be here to see everyone. Let me just do a quick introduction for MISC, if you're not too familiar about us. We are a shipping conglomerate right smack in the middle of the fossil fuel supply chain. FPSOs, gas carriers, oil carriers. So we know the threat to our business. Why? We carry the very cargo that everyone is trying to reduce consuming, and we burn the very same fossil fuel to power vessels. So it's, in many ways, it's a double whammy. It's a risk, and I wish to acknowledge that. But I think, let me start off by saying, in the world today, especially the last couple of years, whereby all we have seen in headlines are confrontation, fragmentation, disunity, I would like to applaud everyone in the global shipping industry, especially the past 12, 18 months, because we've gone the other way. We have shown unity. We've shown collaboration. We've shown the way in which how we can make the world a better place. So I applaud all of you for doing that. Thank you very much for that. To say that we have not progressed in our battle to decarbonize would be a disservice. The past 18 months, there have been rapid activities, rapid projects that have been deployed. We've come a long way since 12 months ago. The question, as Nick asked, is it enough? Is it fast enough? And this is where, because of my fondness for movie, I will quote a very famous actor in a famous movie, Tom Cruise in Top Gun. We have a need for speed. We have a need for more speed. Why? I'm sure all of you read the latest IPCC report. GHG emission has to peak by 2025 if you believe the scientists. It's only 3 years away. 3 years is not a lot of time. So there's a need for speed. And in my perspective, how do we accelerate? And I believe it's more than technology. I believe it's about leadership. I understand this whole journey to decarb is about money. Let's address elephant in the room. It's about money. It's about costs to greenify the entire industry. It's about risks because technology, safety, operational standards are not there yet. What we need is courageous leadership. We need to get our stakeholders, our board of directors, our shareholders to be behind us on this cause, to do what is right. So to me, it's leadership. And we need more leadership hubs, decarb centers, the various joint global projects. These to me are examples of leadership hubs. We need more of that because each hub would create a ripple. It expands as you rope in more players. And eventually, all these leadership ripple will overlap. The work, I'm very heartened to see the MOU between Singapore and Japan, Itochu. That's an example of two leadership hubs, the ripple intersecting. When you intersect, that's when common practices will be introduced. Plenty of common practices, which means rapid homogeneity, standard regulation, and that's key to bringing costs down, is economics 101. So to me, we need more leadership, we need more courage, we need more fearless action.
Thank you, Datuk. Lars.
Thank you, Nick. And yes, it's great to be here all together. And I think that what we have seen and heard over the last 3 days is a clear signal of the commitment that there is in the community and the industry to the decarbonization and moving forward. The ship owners are clearly committed, and we all have various initiatives which we are taking on, more or less individually, probably a little bit too fragmented. PIL recently ordered LNG, dual fuel, e-methane ready and ammoniac ready. Now, that was our option. Others take other decisions, and they're all respectful, and they're all important that we at least take initiatives and move forward. Ordering ships today is actually ordering ships for the next 25 years. And 25 years means that we will get into 2050, meaning that we'll reach a very important date. Now, I think we need to get together in forums like here, in other forums, and make sure that we align. Nobody's going to do it alone. We can all put a lot of energy and resources into it, but the more we combine, the more we'll be efficient together. We know the IMO targets. We know all the rules and things which have been put in place by IMO. I think we are many who also believe that actually we have to move faster. 2050 may be too far away. I think not only maybe, is too far away. And if you talk to the young people, yesterday I was sitting at a panel with young students presenting their projects. 2050 for them is far too long away. They want to see much faster action. And I think we have a responsibility to deliver that. So more aggressive results and more aggressive means and technicalities to get there. One of the key to that, and I think the industry has been repeating it for a while, is that we need to get the carbon pricing in place. That will provoke and initiate a lot of momentum and make sure that we take the right decisions. We have to appeal to IMO to make sure that we get there. I think IMO is the vehicle to do it. If we don't do it, we will be probably subject to a lot of differentiated pricing, which will be extremely difficult to cope with in a global industry. So it'll help, and we'll get the momentum. I think it's also worthwhile to repeat and just share with you the World Shipping Council, which is our our industry association in liner shipping. They have formulated 6 points, I think, which summarizes what we need to focus on. The first one is about the global carbon pricing, which is also related to the second point, which is that we need to allocate a portion of that tax to research and development, which has to go into the industry and make sure that we all move forward quickly in solutions. We must also evaluate the fuels and solutions on life cycle basis, not only what emission do we see on board our ships once it's there. It's important we encompass the whole cycle. Developing scalable fuel supplies, I think it's a major challenge for the industry today. It's very nice to hear about all the initiatives which are taken here and have been taken in the meantime between all the stakeholders. And it's still a way to go, including logistics and how do we deal with it. We need to develop the green corridors. I think that Singapore is ideally placed to develop green corridors with a hub. Many of us participate in these work today, and it's something which will definitely help us to set some pace and examples for the future. Now, in the meantime, we continue to build ships, on order ships, for the next 25 years, as I mentioned. But as Jeremy Nixon reminded us on Monday, we still have tens of thousands of ships sailing out there for the next 15, 20 years, which will just sail on conventional fuel. So we should not underestimate the need to find solutions for conversion, for carbon capturing, although we know it's still a way to go to get the scale, to get how can we deal with it afterwards. But these developments are important because otherwise we're going to run short of our targets and we're going to slow down too much. So I really encourage that whoever can come up with solutions, share it with us and we'll test and try it. So identifying these solutions is also to make sure we make a real impact on the short term. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars. Perhaps, Lynn, you can share us some initial thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I agree with Datuk I agree with Lars that we don't have the luxury of time. We need to move, and we need to move now. The shipping's emissions went up by 5% last year, and you heard Datuk we have to peak in 2025, which is not that far away. I would say we need to start bending the curve now. We need to do whatever we can to bend the curve now. And whatever we can is going to be different for different stakeholders, and we need to accept that. And I think, so what this means is that change is going to be uncomfortable. The energy transition is going to be messy. There will be stranded assets, but probably not as much as we think there will be, because to build up the supply chain, to build up the infrastructure for green fuels is going to take time. So at GCMD, we're taking a multi-pronged approach to looking at the different kinds of solutions that are available. We chunk it up to looking at near-term solutions, mid-term solutions, and long-term solutions. Of course, we readily acknowledge that in order to get to net zero, you really need the green fuels, and those are what we categorize as long-term solutions. We need to build up the supply chain, we need to build up the infrastructure, you need to have green hydrogen, you need to have green electrons in order to get to the green fuel. So those are going to take some time. Nonetheless, we need to start moving now. And so GCMD has embarked on this study to look at safety associated with bunkering ammonia. When that's done, then we would have the basis to form a regulatory sandbox to actually do the piloting. And in our opinion, that's a no-regret move, right? Because we have to figure out the safety while others figure out the scaling, the production, et cetera, the combustion on the ship, et cetera. We can proceed in parallel. So that's sort of the long-term perspective from GCMD. Then we should look at near-term and mid-term as well. And near-term, There are energy efficiency measures, measures to reduce fuel efficiencies. And so we're looking across the range of solution providers to see how we can accelerate that so that we can help stakeholders adopt those kinds of solutions. In terms of low carbon solutions, while those that have supply chain would be biofuels and LNG. Sure, they have their problems. Biofuels have scaling problems. And LNG, well, there's methane leak and methane slip. I think we can get a hold of that. Engines are getting better. And then if we come back to this idea of bending the curve, if you go on the LNG pathway, and you do a proper life cycle assessment, you take care of the slip and the leakage on the front end. When bio-LNG is available, you use that, you bend the curve some more. When midterm solutions like carbon capture, which is something that we're looking at too, is available, you bend the curve further. That provides the runway for us to develop the infrastructure and the supply chain for green fuels. So that's how we're looking at things. And in terms of sort of what's well and what's needed, I think increasingly we're seeing, as we scope out these projects, we're talking to lots of stakeholders to understand where the pain points are, what's been done, because the last thing we want to do is duplicate efforts. There are lots of these one-off trials, and that's great because we need to get started there. But we need to move beyond the one-off trials, look at route-based pilots, because then you can begin to build the infrastructure and the supply chain on both sides of the ports. Then you can move forward.
Thank you, Lynn. Interesting and really excellent point around ports and ships and making sure we take the whole infrastructure together. Bo, perhaps I can just come to you. Lots of progress already made in the Mærsk-Mc-Kinney Møller Center. Obviously, we're seeing regular updates, but you've got a clear view of how we might see different paces moving in different parts of the world, different geographies. So keen to hear your opening thoughts of what's going well, where we might need some more effort.
Thank you very much. I believe there's a growing and accelerating realization on the inside or outside-in perspective on shipping that we have to move faster. So that realization has been confirmed, I think, here on multiple locations. And there's also a growing realization sort of internally in the ecosystem that we can do it, that the technologies and the fuels are going to be available and possible to implement. So back to the point about leadership, which I think is really a key one. And what is leadership in this case? I think we are in a very difficult situation because you can't really make the business case here on the 10 or 15-year perspective. It's just not possible. I think what we can realize is that full decarbonization of shipping is possible. It's possible over the decades until 2050. And that realization is being confirmed by a lot of different work which is ongoing at the moment. So we're in this situation where the community is realizing that we need to get to zero. It's the right thing to do. There's a lot of ambiguity in the system, but this is exactly the kind of situation where you need strong leadership, very visible leadership that can stand up and create the visions and help respective organizations actually be blunt, be realistic, be clear on the targets and the trajectories. And so from my perspective, being involved now, we have dozens of R&D projects running, and we have multiple MOUs, and we have just involved ourselves in some really great first mover green corridor projects, which I think are truly remarkable. And it's together with leaders of the ecosystem that actually want to lean in and get going. So this is great. I think the next big thing for us is when we will see leaders across the value chain start to put out decarbonization targets and strategies. Put them out in the open, be blunt and speak openly about What are we reaching for? What are we aiming for? How do we get to zero in 2050? And what are the intermediate targets in 2030 and 2040? And I'm not saying it's easy, because it's not, but it is doable now, and then we have to accept that things can be adjusted along the way, because you can't be so prescriptive until 2050. But I really think that's another big thing coming to us very soon, and that would be also a really, really good thing for the whole community.
Thank you, Bo. I think that's a really, really important point that we should reinforce now, that the work since the IMO initial target set in 2018, which some might have said was too ambitious, back, and some maybe said were not ambitious enough back in 2018, has shown, and I think Lloyd Register would agree with that, and I think many would agree with that we can get to zero by 2050. But as Lars has already said, ship owners are still ordering ships today using a carbon-based fuel. We know that ships that are entering service today, or being ordered today, might be delivered by 2025, and they're not going to be, hopefully they will be able to have a full life. And one would hope that they're going to be modified and adaptable and able to operate safely and environmentally friendly throughout that life. But do you think, and the green corridors thing, I think, is a key aspect here. Do you think that message is getting through to sufficient governments in order to support IMO to put a more ambitious agreement in place by 2023? Because I think many of us are waiting for IMO to come out with something that says zero by 2050 or net zero by 2050 at least. And yet the clock's ticking, ships continue to be ordered. Certain sectors we've seen are booming and are filling the shipyards up. Shipyards are getting full now to 2025. So it feels like there's growing ambition, but the target is still in the wrong place at the moment. And I think governments and their voting rights at IMO is quite a key stakeholder.
Yeah, so to answer that very directly, I'm not ready to sort of lean back and think this is going to be a smooth ride, because it's not. I think the country perspective and the government perspective is now very focused on, as it has been, but increasingly now also with this new crisis, on the national perspective of climate targets, and now particularly also security of energy supply. And so shipping has always been a little bit outside of that primary national perspective. And I think right now a lot of countries have realized that we need to put the zero target. It was confirmed in COP26, I think, quite widely that that's the right target for our sector as well. And I think many of us who went to COP26 have an expectation that strong players, strong voices will go to IMO and make sure that it becomes a zero target. But I can't, based on history, I don't think it's a given that it will happen, unfortunately, even if I really think it's the right thing to do. And a lot of countries and industry players believe it's the right target to set.
Thank you. If I can just go back to Datuk for a moment. You talked about the importance of leadership and actually taking action today. Where are you seeing the most obvious signs of that taking place, and what are the next steps? How do we start moving into real projects as opposed to well-intended research projects and paperwork exercises?
Well, obviously, first we've got to conceive plenty of ideas on paper. We need plenty of that, and that in itself takes leadership and courage. Next thing is to turn from paper to steel. And what we did in the CASA initiative was to take that first step, to turn a paper project into a steel project. And again, the issue of taking risk and cost risk, when we first started with the CASA initiative, we knew we got to solve this problem. but we do not have all the answers. But we told ourselves we will break the problem into small chunks, and we'll solve the problem along the way, the risk along the way, and build our courage along the way. And along the way, we brought in more partners, and today we have partners working on regulations, the safe handling of ammonia as bunker. We've got partners working on the build, the engine, the emission, and we have partners working on training our seafarers to be prepared. So have we solved the full risk equation? No. Why? This is where I would appeal to the leaders in the room here, customers, cargo owners, financiers. Join us. Join us. You have your cost and your risk concern. We do. But together, we would solve it. And then from paper to steel, it will become reality. And I hope this encourages all the projects around the world to go along the same curve. I like Lynn's analogy of bend the curve. But I would say bend it upwards. Steepen it. 90 degrees. That's when you get speed.
Thank you, Datuk Yi. And Lynn, you talked about chunking up the challenge. You talked about it possibly getting messy. What do you think are the first chunks? Next 12 months, let's try and... how do we make the bamboo bend the most in these next 12 months?
Oh, that's a hard question. I think it's all of the above. We need to do everything, but I can tell you what GCMD is focusing on. I mentioned the safety study. So in 12 months, the safety study would be done. And so we would have the safety guidelines that will form the regulatory sandbox for a pilot. We would know where we can actually, we would have identified 2 sites in Singapore where we can do this bunkering pilot. So I think coming back to what Datuk Yi has said about financing too, I think increasingly we need to think about the financing, because the next step would be a first-of-a-kind project. It's a commercial project, but it's a first-of-a-kind project. That's going to require financing. And while we have a war chest, that war chest is tiny in comparison with what one needs for such a project, right? And so financing is going to be needed. And frequently what we see is that the appetite from the financiers, the risk appetite, does not necessarily match the risk profile of such first-of-a-kind projects. And so we need to think about how we can mush those two together and align them and unlock that financing for these kinds of projects. And so we believe we can play a role in that, given that we're doing a lot of the due diligence and we're looking at this, and we can de-risk some of the operational risks, some of the technical risks, if you will. But I think there needs to be sort of an alignment in terms of risk appetite and risk profile. That could come in the form of loan guarantees from governments. That could come in the form of grants. You could come alongside a conventional financial institution, in which case, you lower the risk for them to come in. So I think we need to think along those lines as well, because I think like Lars and Datuk Yi mentioned, there are lots of pilots going on. So increasingly within the next 12 months, there will be chances and opportunity to think about these first-of-a-kind commercial pilots. And then it's really unlocking the finance to be able to support that.
Thank you, Lynn. I'm going to go back to Lars now, because you mentioned the World Shipping Council, very clear, 6 steps, not too complicated. It's probably one of the shortest number of words I've seen in terms of how we solve this. And I think a lot of people recognize that those shipping companies operating on liner routes, regular ports of call, limited number of ports that you might be visiting compared to other sectors, have perhaps the biggest opportunity to get the green corridors up and running. You have also potentially the clearest visibility about where your ships are going to be operating in 5 years or in 10 years' time. And it could be argued you have some of the most consumer-linked cargoes that you're carrying. So Lars, are we going to see green corridors pushed forward under the World Shipping Council, you think, and we get this egg and chicken connected between infrastructure, imports, and availability of fuel connected with liner operations? I mean, many people have talked about the critical link, of course, east-west between Singapore and Rotterdam, or at least Singapore and Europe. We're seeing lots of positive work going on between the ports. Just seen an MOU signed today, I think with 17 ports involved. Is that the best place to start, Lars, in your mind?
I think, as we mentioned before, that first of all, we have to be pragmatic. I mean, it's not going to happen overnight. It'll take time. And as Lynn said, it may be sometimes a little bit messy. But as long as we move forward, it's the right thing to do. I think the green corridors will come. I think also because of the alternative fuels which we are going to develop together will be available in smaller scale initially. So that means that inter-European, which is developing, it means that corridors around Singapore, where I think we see very good initiatives and development in the fueling possibilities, will happen. And they are easier to work with, and they are also less risky in terms of investment, in terms of engagement. So that's a good way to start. Awaiting the bigger solutions, which still has to come, and we also need to have a little more visibility. I know many have been in the same situation as me, but I can tell you, and talking about the lifetime of ships, when you go to your board of directors today and recommend to buy a number of ships, and then we start talking about lifetime of your investment, you get challenged. But it cannot be only economical reasons, it cannot be only just safe bet. We need to stick our neck out and get these things done. I also saw recently that there was somebody, or a number of people who said, well, why are we so slow about it? Why don't we just do like for the low sulfur, we put a date, and then that's it, you just do it. I mean, this is not like the low sulfur. Low sulfur, we had the fuel, the ships could use it. It was mainly a pricing issue. So that was an easy one to do. This one is definitely more complicated. So awaiting the more sort of ultimate solution, it's really important that we start working on these smaller solutions now. One thing I just wanted to add, and you also referred to it, something we have to work on very early and in parallel, and I'm glad there was some discussion about it also here yesterday, is the whole seafarer and labor solutions also. There's a very important demand from our seafarers and our labor to be involved and engage early days with these at new techniques and new skills which need to be required. So we are, through Singapore Marine Foundation and a lot of other parties, we're working with a just transition. And I think it's important as ship owners and community that we really engage and get that discussion going.
Yeah, indeed. I think there are many, and there's a number of questions that I can see coming in here on Pigeonhole. There are many unintended consequences potentially coming from this transition, and I think even green corridors, as seen as maybe the most practical way to enable the transition, to start the transition and to build scale, could result in the communities that need the supply chains that we provide and have provided to them historically, perhaps suffering and then moving last. So it's a really difficult balance to get right. How do we get the people and the skills and the talent in the industry developed at the same speed at which the hardware might be developed? What do we do in terms of emergency situations? Lots and lots of issues to consider, and I'm confident that actually the progress that we're seeing around the, let's say, technology is moving with quite significant pace. But I do think the human element and the fair and just transition is something that's only just starting to build some pace and build some volume. I'm maybe just looking at Datuk Yi here. Energy security. you're providing energy to communities around the world that don't have necessarily, on a national scale, the opportunity to decarbonise the ability to have mobility of goods, mobility of people. How does MISC adopt and address the fair and just transition, and balancing that with all of the pressure that's coming from ESG, and to show that you're making progress?
That's a tough question, because, so let me just again touch on human element, as Lars has sort of opened up. I think first of all, we need to look at just transition, diversity, equality, and inclusion for seafarers, and not just seafarers, the entire working population of the entire maritime chain. I think first of all, let's look at the regulated training for seafarers, right? SCCW. It has to be relooked at because it caters to the past. I don't think it caters for the future. It doesn't train our seafarers to deal with Industry 4.0. It doesn't train our people to handle the new technologies safely. So I think that will be the work for the regulators. But for us, on the private sector side, we can start working with academies, institutions to start blending the technology with how we translate it into training, human element. I think we should start now because the ability of the human element to meet the technology, it must at the same pace. It must. And I urge everyone to start working in it right now. And also, with all the decarb centers and this whole journey to try and decarbonize the industry, we will need very diverse skill sets coming into the industry. I was talking to Bo earlier about the people they are hiring into the center, right? It's not just the traditional marine engineers, naval arcs. No, we're talking about chemical engineers, biologists, marine biologists, right? Diversity and inclusion is not just about gender. It's also about skill. And for all of us complaining that the global maritime industry is not appealing, well, speak to the younger crowd today, right? We always say, how do I understand how the millennials and the Gen Y work? I've got a daughter going from 14 to 21 in space of 1 year. How do you understand them? And this is my theory. Human behavior. Our generation, remember, we all learned this thing about Maslow hierarchy of needs, a very base survival. As society become more affluent, our kids are not about survival. And you speak to them, they say, I don't need a car because I've got Uber, I've got Grab. I don't need a house because I've got Airbnb. They live in a different state. They are now operating at a higher level now, self-actualization. They will go and save the world. Well, the world needs saving. We need to decarbonize. Come join the global maritime industry. Help us to save the world. That's how we say that we should do it.
Thank you, Datuk. One last prepared question, and I can't help but see Ambassador Hom in front of me and congratulate you for staying for the whole conference. Because I think we've also talked about the importance here, and Lynn, you mentioned it, about funding, government support, incentives, carrots versus sticks. And perhaps I can come to both Lynn and Bo here, because Bo, you've just made a big announcement around establishing green corridors, I think in North Europe. And it looks like more and more governments are listening. They're seeing that there's private interest here. There's individual companies wanting to push ahead, needing support from government. Are you confident between the two of you that we can get the necessary government support to put the incentives in place for the land-based infrastructure in ports, in fuel production?
Sure, I'll go ahead. The way I see it, we don't have a choice. I mean, we think this is really important from an operational feasibility standpoint. As Lars mentioned, the green fuels are going to come in gradually. And so, I mean, as opposed to sprinkling them across the world, you need to aggregate them and demonstrate that you can actually lower carbon emissions voyage by voyage, route by route. So the way I see it, I mean, from an operational standpoint, from a piloting standpoint, in order to bend the curve, we don't really have a choice. And I think governments need to come in. They need to have skin in the game just as much as all the rest of the stakeholders need to have a skin in the game in this.
It's for sure the right thing to do, and like I said earlier, I think there's just pretty much an anonymous, realization also amongst governments that it's the right thing to do. When we talk to governments, the perspectives are very different. So each country has its own perspective of why, how do you make this work for your country? It's about innovation and workplaces. It's about putting your ports forward to be the leading ports of the world. It's about, of course, supporting international shipping and the agenda there. It's about domestic emissions. It's about a lot of things. So it's a very nuanced picture. So to answer your question is, I think yes, in general, there's a lot of resources available to do it, but it doesn't happen just like that. So you really need to go in and work with each of them and figure out what is the win-win case for each of the countries involving themselves in this. And the just part of the transition is extremely important. And so to get developing countries into the dialogue as well and really start to work on a very concrete basis on how is this going to create wealth and job places and education and social developments in countries that are running a risk of not being a part of the transition. I think that's a really important part of it too. So there are really so many aspects to it, and it's exactly the same as the developments in IMO, that it's easy to sit on the outside and say that it's not moving fast enough and IMO should just get going. But IMO is a collection of countries that each have their own, issues and dilemmas and priorities, and therefore, I just think we need to be a little bit humble to that situation, that you really need to understand what are the real drivers of this. But then coming back to answer, I think for all the green corridors we're working with now, we're working very concretely with named countries and governments, and they are all eager to engage and to, in the first place, work to understand what are those win-wins, and I believe also eventually to invest. And of course, for us, EU is one of the big players in this, and EU has the Fit for 55 strategy, which is also going to mobilize a lot of resources to really support this agenda. So I think we can be hopeful that very concrete developments will be supported very soon.
Thank you both. I'm conscious our clock's just turned red, and I've not yet had the opportunity to go to a lot of great questions here on Pigeonhole. But there's one that hopefully I've pressed the right button and it's now activated, and I need to come back to our ship owners here on the panel. So the question is, will the main decarbonisation push come from IMO, or rather from giant customers like Amazon, IKEA, Apple, etc.?
And again, I think it's not one solution, one who would do everything themselves. Obviously, there's a strong demand from big international shippers to meet their requirements and be part to their carbon footprint also, which is good because it puts obligations on the shipping lines, actually oblige us to go faster. And this is something which we welcome. At the same time, we still need to have the alignment, and we still need to have the environment in our communities and with the regulators to support and move forward. So I think it's going to come from all over.
In an ideal state, you would like the public and private sector to move at the same speed. That's when you get ultimate speed. But the honest truth is, I think it was also a topic which came up in last year's Global Maritime Forum. It's the private sector is moving ahead a lot faster than the public sector, IMO and things like that. perhaps the speed in which we pick up on the private sector would help carry and encourage the private sector to move faster. But right now, the way I see it is more on the private sector side, and it could be just both the effort of ship owners, ship managers, technology provider, again, cargo owners, our customer, our financiers, join us, and we'll make the private sector move very fast, and along with it, we'll carry the public sector as well.
Thank you very much. Our time went so quick, as it always does. We could talk about this all day, and we will be talking about this all day. So please join me in thanking our panelists today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Nicholas and our distinguished panelists. Thank you. Thank you. I would like you to remind you to put on your mask, and would like to invite you back to your seats. Thank you very much.